Hello and welcome back to Book Nerd TV. Today I thought I'd bring you my top 10 podcasts that I listened to in 2019. I feel like this list of podcasts is fairly diverse, so that if you don't like one type or brand of podcast, I think there's enough diversity on the list that you might be able to find something that you'll enjoy. I've grouped my top 10 list into 4 different groups of podcasts. The groupings are general podcasts, maybe even general comedic podcasts. The second group is storytelling podcasts, and these are podcasts that feature short stories as the main content. The third grouping is new in 19, so these are new podcasts that I started listening to in 2019 and I'm still listening to as we move into 2020. The last group is Gone But Not Forgotten, and once I get to that section, you'll understand what that means. The first podcast in my general comedic, maybe I should even say current events podcast, is The Black Guy Who Tips with Rod and Karen Morrow. Rod and Karen cover current events, be they political, social, economic. They throw in a healthy dose of celebrity culture every now and again. All of these topics that they cover, they do so with their brand of humor. And while the humor is present, they treat the topics very seriously. Sometimes they can give you that reinforcing shot of humor so that the pain isn't quite as bad, so that the sting isn't quite as bad. And sometimes they just cover the events or the news stories with all the passion and anger that a human being feels. And they use their humor to move us from some of the more painful or stressful topics into something a little more humorous so that we can reduce the temperature level while listening to some of these stories. They are a hardworking couple, and if you've not listened to their podcast, I highly recommend that you do now. Be aware that some of the language, it's adult language, adult humor. So not like crass adult humor, but just, sometimes I guess it can be a little crass on people, but neither here nor there. The humor is adult. The language is adult. So respond and listen accordingly. Number 2 of my general podcast is Dense Pixels. Dense Pixels is hosted by Brad, Micah, Terrence, and Carrie. So there are 4 people who host, co-host, team host, I guess, this podcast. Brad, Micah, and Terrence are the main 3 who were there for most of the podcast. Although recently, Carrie has been jumping in more often when either Terrence or Micah are unable to make it. But in any combination of the 4, you will enjoy the nerdery that goes on as these 4 talk about gaming. Mostly gaming. Sometimes we get a little bit of tangential comic book information or technology information, but mainly it's a gaming podcast. So they cover all of the news once a week, all of the news that has come out the prior week related to gaming. If you're on the lookout for a really great gaming related podcast, check out Dense Pixels. I do not think that you will be disappointed in what you find. The last one in my general group is Stuff You Should Know. I've been listening to Stuff You Should Know, again, probably 6 or 7 years. The hosts are Josh Clark and Chuck Bryant. The Stuff You Should Know podcast really is eclectic, I would say. Not even general, eclectic. But they also cover these sort of weird little interesting topics that you wouldn't necessarily think about. It's just, they even have a short version of their Stuff You Should Know podcast called Short Stuff. So if you're just interested in something that's entertaining and informative, right? Entertaining and educational, dare I say. Stuff You Should Know is definitely a podcast that you should listen to. I promise you will enjoy it. How Stuff Works can be listened to general audience. If you haven't tried Stuff You Should Know or the How Stuff Works network of shows, I highly recommend. My next grouping is Storytelling Podcast, and the first one in my Storytelling Podcast is, of course, LeVar Burton reads. Need I say more? LeVar Burton reads is the most excellent storytelling podcast. And I've been listening to storytelling podcasts for a while. But his is, of course, I mean, it's LeVar Burton. What else can you say? He has a wonderful voice. He narrates stories so well. LeVar Burton Reads, the podcast, covers science fiction, regular fiction, all manner of short stories. Two of my favorite stories from the podcast are, I know for sure, Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. Oh my gosh. I have listened to Paper Menagerie at least 3 times. That is such a well written and well narrated short story. So if you've not tried LeVar Burton Reads before and you want to jump in or at least sample what it is that you may get from LeVar Burton Reads, the podcast, listen to Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, narrated, of course, by the wonderful, amazing LeVar Burton. The second story that really stuck with me that LeVar Burton read on the podcast is What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky by Leslie Neka Arima. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And that was one of the first stories, and that just really, I enjoyed that story so much. And I'd never heard of Leslie Neka Arima before his podcast. So not only did I get a good story, I also got to discover a new author. And so win all the way around. Remember, give LeVar Burton Reads a try. I do not think you'll be disappointed. The second podcast in my storytelling grouping is Escape Pod, put out by Escape Artists. Right now, it's edited by Mur Lafferty and S.B. Divya, which also may be Divya Breed. I couldn't figure out if they were the same person or two different people. And I've seen the name written 2 different ways, so I thought I'd say them both just to kind of cover myself. This is one of the first storytelling podcasts I started listening to, years ago. I don't even remember how I found this podcast, but I am so glad that I did, because the range of storytelling within the science fiction genre is just wonderful. I don't think you'll be disappointed at all. You'll find a story or 2 or 3 or 7 or 27 that you enjoy from this podcast. The narrators differ. The hosts of the show differ as well, but the content is always interesting, intriguing, and entertaining. So go forth, find Escape Pod, enjoy. Number 3 in my storytelling grouping is Clarkesworld. I know I mentioned Clarkesworld when I discussed The Secret Life of Bots by Suzanne Palmer. Clarkesworld, and I believe the proper name may be Clarkesworld Magazine Podcast. It is hosted and narrated by Kate Baker, another person with a really nice narrating voice. Very nice voice. Clarkesworld offers science fiction and fantasy. If you are lucky, like me, you'll find several short stories that you know you want to save so that you can listen to over and over and over again, like I've done. I've saved quite a few of the stories from Clarkesworld. I enjoy the selection. I enjoy the storytelling ability of Kate Baker. It's just a well done podcast. And if you're interested, again, in any sort of storytelling podcast featuring science fiction or fantasy, go ahead and try Clarkesworld. The next grouping is New in 19. So these are podcasts that I discovered in 2019, and I know that I'll continue to listen to moving into 2020. First one is 3 Guys On, and it's hosted by Randolph Terrence, Andy Klein, sometimes intermittently Tim Miller. And I say intermittently because I don't think Tim Miller is as constant a host as the other 2 guys, Randolph Terrence and Andy Klein. And because Tim Miller is not the constant third host of 3 Guys On, they have this sort of rotating roster of co-hosts that they call sock puppets. You have to listen to Three Guys On to understand why the whole rotating roster of sock puppets matter. But the sock puppets bring a whole different dynamic depending on the particular sock puppet, and there are quite a few of them. They wrote a song about it that is actually the opening music for the podcast. And so you get this really comedic take on current events. They post for us freeloaders, and I am a freeloader, one podcast a week. And let us remember that this is a podcast run by comics. So sometimes the humor can be a little problematic, I think, for some people. And so I give you that caveat, that warning, before you listen. Most of the time, as I've listened, the content has been great. Again, I would probably make sure that I didn't have anyone under 18 maybe listening to, adult humor. Govern yourselves accordingly. The second in my group for New in 19 is The Stacks, and it's hosted by Tracy Thomas. I literally just discovered The Stacks maybe 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. I'm not quite sure how I found The Stacks. I think I was looking for something else, and The Stacks was in the list of recommended from the initial whatever it was that I was looking for, and I saw that it was about books. And I talk about books on BookTube, Marriage Made in Heaven. You never know with podcasts whether it's something that you're going to resonate with or it's going to resonate with you. Luckily for me, The Stacks absolutely has resonated. If I understand the format correctly, Tracy Thomas invites an author on, and she does 2 different podcasts with them. One is maybe just some general, all about the author information, and then the second is their conversation about a book they've both read. It's not the author's book, mind you. It's another book that they've read by a different author. So if you enjoy BookTube, you may really enjoy The Stacks. Again, it's a podcast format, but it's still kind of BookTubey, if that makes any sense. I don't know why I did that, but anyway, I'm fairly certain that if you enjoy BookTube in all its iterations, then you stand a really good chance of enjoying The Stacks, because again, you get live author interviews, discussions about books. I mean, what could be better? And your hands can be free while you do other things and listen. My last of this New in 19 group is Waveform. Waveform is a podcast by Marquez Brownlee, and since you watch BookTube, it means you watch YouTube, which means you've probably seen Marquez Brownlee before. His YouTube channel is MKBHD, and it's him talking about technology. He's a young man who has interviewed Bill Gates, Elon Musk, some other person that I can't think of right now, but he manages to get these really great interviews with innovators and major players in technology. His podcast is basically an audio version of his YouTube channel. And if you're interested in technology, if you're interested in the latest information about technology, emerging technology, try Waveform. I think it's a good entree, I think, if you're that tech nerd or that tech person who is looking for a way into the world of podcasts. Although if you're a tech person, my thought would be you would already be into podcasts, but that's neither here nor there, really. My last group is Gone But Not Forgotten. And Gone But Not Forgotten this year for 2019 goes to Thinking Sideways. I love this podcast. It is a mystery, unsolved mystery, strange, spooky, uncanny sort of podcast. So not really true crime, although they do talk about like some murder mysteries that have happened, but really it is an investigation into the mystery, into the unsolved, into the unexplained. The hosts are Devin, Joe, and Steve. The podcast ran, I believe, from 2013 and ended in late 2017, early 2018. And the podcast, as I understand, from what I've read, the podcast ended because one of the hosts ended up moving out of the country. And I guess the logistics of trying to time when this person would be available to do the podcast was really just not something that they could really work out. So sadly, the podcast ended. I'm hoping that when the third host comes back from outside the United States, that the crew will get back together again. Thinking Sideways will start being published and produced again, and I can enjoy the content. I'm just gonna hold on to that hope because, like I said, the content is very enjoyable, except for possibly the content when they discuss murder mysteries. I think the content is accessible to everyone. I would put maybe a 16-year-old limit on there just in case. The murder mystery stuff can be a little bit intense, perhaps, for someone 16 and younger. But otherwise, general audience, if you have never heard of Thinking Sideways, go find it on your podcatcher and listen. And join me in hoping that they come back and start the podcast up again. So I guess that's it for my inaugural end of year podcast review. I certainly hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you do, please remember to leave me a like. If you're enjoying the content on the channel thus far, please go ahead and subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate it. If you want to be notified whenever a new one of these comes out, remember to go ahead and click that notification bell. And remember, whether you're listening to a storytelling podcast or you have a hard copy book in front of you, there is always time to read. Bye-bye.